the only name erased from the book of life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty square of ancient Canaan. A crowd had gathered, their faces stern with judgment, as they watched a young woman being led to her fate, Tamar, twice widowed and now heavy with child, walked with dignity despite the weight of shame and accusation. The verdict had been swift death by burning for adultery, yet in her eyes burned, not fear, but a quiet determination. This scene, dramatic as it may be, is but the final act of a story that began years earlier. A tale of divine judgment so swift and absolute that it forever marked the lineage of the Messiah. At its heart lies the mystery of the only man in biblical history whom God chose to strike down without warning or chance for redemption. What manner of wickedness could warrant such devastating judgment? What crime could be so grave that the Almighty would erase a man's name from the book of life with a single sentence? The answer lies buried in the depths of Genesis, in a chapter often overlooked, yet bearing profound implications for understanding divine justice and human responsibility. Was no ordinary man. Born as the firstborn son of Judah, he carried in his blood the promise made to Abraham that through his lineage would come the blessing for all nations. His grandfather was Jacob, renamed Israel by God himself. His great-grandfather was Isaac, the miracle child of promise, and before him, Abraham, the father of faith, stood at the crossroads of history, bearing the weight of divine destiny upon his shoulders. Yet something went terribly wrong. In the brief span between his marriage to Tamar and his untimely death, committed acts so grievous that they warranted immediate divine intervention. The Bible, usually generous with details, reduces his entire life to a single, chilling verse. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. The silence surrounding his specific sins speaks volumes. In a text that doesn't shy away from describing human failings, from Adam's disobedience to David's adultery, the complete omission of transgressions suggests something too dark to record. What evil could be so profound that it warranted not just death, but the complete erasure of legacy today? We delve deep into this enigmatic story. We'll uncover the historical context that shaped choices, examine the devastating consequences of his actions, and explore how his dramatic removal from history became a turning point in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Through this journey, we'll confront timeless questions about justice, mercy, and the weight of divine calling. But first, we must return to that dusty square, where Tamar stands accused. For in her story lies the key to understanding not just downfall, but also the remarkable way God can bring redemption from the ashes of human failure. Her tale of courage and faith would transform what began as a story of judgment into one of hope and divine purpose. This is more than just a historical account. It's a mirror reflecting the eternal struggle between human weakness and divine purpose, between justice and mercy, between the weight of destiny and the freedom of choice. As we unravel this ancient mystery, we'll discover truths that resonate deeply with our own struggles and hopes. A world between two cultures, the age of the patriarchs, to understand tragic fate. We must first step back into a world vastly different from our own, the era of the patriarchs. Spanning roughly from the 19th to 16th centuries, BCE, this was a time when empires rose and fell, when oral traditions carried the weight of law, and when a family's honor meant everything. In this landscape of shifting alliances and ancient customs, the story of unfolded against a backdrop of profound cultural tension. The word was born into straddled two distinct civilizations. On one side stood the heritage of Abraham, a tradition of monotheism and divine promise. These were a people who traced their lineage through carefully preserved genealogies, who carried in their hearts the memory of supernatural encounters with the one true God. They lived as strangers in foreign lands, guided by promises of a future homeland and a destiny that would impact all nations. On the other side lay the sophisticated but polytheistic culture of Canaan. The Canaanites were not primitive tribesmen, as often misunderstood, but rather a developed society with complex religious practices, advanced agriculture, and established urban centers. Their temples rose high above cities like Adullam and Timnah, where merchants traded in purple-dyed wool and craftsmen worked in bronze and gold. Their gods were numerous, their rituals elaborate, and their moral codes significantly different from the austere monotheism of Abraham's descendants. Into this complex world stepped Judah, Er's father, making a decision that would have far-reaching consequences, breaking with the traditions of his forebears. He chose to marry a Canaanite woman, the daughter of Shua. This wasn't merely a marriage, it was a dramatic departure from the careful separation his ancestors had maintained. Abraham had specifically warned against such unions, sending his servant on a long journey to find a wife for Isaac from among their own people. Isaac and Rebekah had grieved when their son Esau chose Hittite wives. The implications of Judah's choice were profound. Would be raised in a household where two worldviews collided daily. His mother's polytheistic background would have exposed him to Canaanite customs and beliefs from birth. The very air he breathed was thick with the incense of foreign gods, while his father's heritage demanded exclusive allegiance to the God of Abraham. This cultural tension manifested in every aspect of daily life. The agricultural festivals of the Canaanites, with their elaborate rituals to ensure fertility, stood in stark contrast to the austere worship of Yahweh. The social customs surrounding marriage, death, and inheritance differed significantly between the two cultures. Even the understanding of morality and justice took different forms in these competing worldviews. The physical environment reflected this duality. Would have grown up in Adullam, a region where Canaanite influence was strong. The city's markets would have been filled with traders from different cultures, its streets echoing with multiple languages. Yet within this diverse setting, his family carried the weight of a unique calling. They were bearers of the divine promise, chosen to be a blessing to all nations. For this meant inheriting not just property or social status, but a divine mandate. As Judah's firstborn, he stood next in line in a genealogy that carried cosmic significance. The promises made to Abraham would flow through him. The future Messiah would trace his lineage through this family line. It was a responsibility that required not just adherence to religious customs, but a deep understanding of their purpose and meaning. This cultural complexity helps us understand the magnitude of what was at stake. Wasn't simply another young man making poor choices. He was the heir to a divine promise. Raised in an environment where competing worldviews fought for dominance, his story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of losing one's spiritual identity in a world of conflicting values. As we shall see, this background of cultural tension and divine purpose sets the stage for the dramatic events that would unfold. Choices, shaped by these competing influences, would lead to consequences that would echo through generations, affecting not just his family but the entire messianic lineage. The fall of the firstborn, Er's tragic journey. The birth of a firstborn son was always a moment of celebration in ancient cultures, but Er's arrival carried exceptional significance as Judah held his newborn heir. The weight of generations rested in that tiny bundle. The name chosen for him, meaning watchful, seemed to prophesy a destiny of vigilance and responsibility. Yet in a cruel twist of irony, this child, who should have watched over the divine inheritance, would become blind to its value. Growing up as Judah's firstborn granted extraordinary privileges. In the patriarchal society of ancient Canaan, the firstborn son received a double portion of inheritance and, more importantly, the mantle of spiritual leadership. The community would have marked his every milestone with special attention, his first steps, his first words, his coming of age. Each achievement was not just a personal victory, but a sign of the family line's continued strength. But privilege often breeds complacency. As he matured, troubling signs began to emerge. The biblical text maintains a deliberate silence about his childhood and youth. But Jewish tradition fills these gaps with telling details. Some scholars suggest that exposure to Canaanite customs through his mother's family gradually eroded his appreciation for his Hebrew heritage. The allure of polytheistic rituals, with their sensual appeal and immediate gratification, may have proved more attractive than the austere demands of his father's God. When the time came for marriage, Judah chose Tamar as bride. The name Tamar, meaning palm tree, suggested strength and uprightness, qualities that would stand in stark contrast to her husband's character. The marriage arrangements would have been elaborate, involving careful negotiations between families and the exchange of significant dowries. For Judah, this union represented more than a typical marriage. It was meant to secure the next generation of the promised lineage. Here, the narrative takes a dark turn. The Bible records that was wicked in the sight of the Lord. This simple statement masks a horror that the ancient writers seemed reluctant to detail. What kind of wickedness could warrant such divine intervention? Jewish commentaries suggest several possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Some propose that like his brother Onan after him, deliberately prevented Tamar from conceiving, perhaps to preserve her beauty or protect his inheritance. Others suggest he introduced idolatrous practices into their home, corrupting the very bloodline meant to carry the divine promise. The most chilling aspect of sin wasn't just its nature, but its deliberateness. Unlike other biblical figures who stumbled into transgression through weakness or circumstance, wickedness appears calculated and persistent. He stood at the crossroads of two cultures and made a conscious choice to reject his spiritual heritage. Every day, he woke up as the heir to Abraham's blessing and chose to squander that inheritance. The divine response was swift and absolute. No warning was given, no opportunity for repentance offered. The text simply states that the Lord put him to death. This unprecedented intervention reveals the severity of offense. Throughout Scripture, God is portrayed as patient and merciful, often extending multiple chances for redemption. Even in cases of severe transgression, prophetic warnings typically preceded judgment. But with the judgment was immediate and final. His death sent shockwaves through the community. Here was the firstborn son of Judah, heir to the promises, struck down by divine decree. The implications were staggering. What would become of the promised lineage? How would this affect the divine plan for Tamar? Now, a young widow, the tragedy was intensely personal. Her marriage, which should have established her as the mother of a new generation in this prestigious family, had ended in shame and sorrow. Death created a void in the genealogy that threatened the continuation of the divine promise. According to custom, his brother would need to step in and provide an heir in name. But the damage to the family's spiritual foundation had already been done. Er's rejection of his calling had set in motion a chain of events that would test the faith and character of everyone involved. In the end, became a cautionary tale, the man who had everything and lost it all through his own choices. His brief life and dramatic death stand as a testament to the seriousness of spiritual responsibility and the consequences of rejecting divine purpose. Yet even in this darkness, seeds of redemption were being sown, though none could see it at the time. Tamar's challenge, from widow to warrior. The sudden death of left Tamar in an impossible position. In ancient Near Eastern society, a young widow's status was precarious at best, without children to secure her position and provide for her future. She faced not just social marginalization, but potential destitution. Yet Tamar's situation was even more complex. She wasn't just any widow, but the childless wife of the firstborn son, in a lineage carrying divine promise. Custom and law provided a solution, the practice of levirate marriage. When a man died without an heir, his brother was obligated to marry the widow and father a child who would legally be considered the deceased man's offspring. This wasn't merely a social convention, it was a sacred duty designed to preserve family lines and protect vulnerable widows. Following this tradition, Judah instructed his second son, Onan, to fulfill this responsibility with Tamar. But Onan harbored darker motives. Knowing that any child born would legally be Er's heir, and thus inherit the larger portion of the family wealth, he repeatedly sabotaged the possibility of conception. Each time he lay with Tamar, he deliberately spilled his seed on the ground. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a calculated attack on the divine promise itself, like his brother before him. Onan's actions warranted divine judgment, and he too was struck down. Twice widowed and still childless, Tamar now faced an even more desperate situation. According to custom, she should have been given to Judah's third son, Shelah. But Judah, haunted by the deaths of his two eldest sons, hesitated. He sent Tamar back to her father's house with a promise: wait until Shelah grows up. It was a promise he never intended to keep. Years passed. Tamar watched as Shelah reached maturity. Yet Judah made no move to fulfill his obligation. She found herself trapped in a limbo of endless waiting, her youth slipping away, her purpose unfulfilled. But Tamar understood something profound. This wasn't just about her personal rights or happiness. The very lineage of the divine promise hung in the balance. It was then that Tamar conceived her daring plan. Learning that Judah, recently widowed himself, would be traveling to Timnah for the sheep shearing, a time traditionally associated with celebration and decreased vigilance, she made her move, removing her widow's garments. She covered herself with a veil and positioned herself where Judah would pass by. The risk was enormous. If discovered, she faced not just shame, but possible death. Yet Tamar's actions weren't born of desperation alone, but of a deep understanding of her role in the divine plan. When Judah approached her, thinking she was a prostitute, she negotiated not just for payment, but for proof: his seal, cord, and staff, items that would irrefutably identify him. The encounter was brief, but its consequences would echo through history. Tamar returned to her widow's garments and waited. When word of her pregnancy reached Judah 3 months later, his reaction was swift and harsh. Bring her out and let her be burned. The punishment for adultery was death. And Judah, perhaps seeking to assert his authority and maintain family honor, showed no mercy. But Tamar had prepared for this moment. As she was being led to execution, she produced the items Judah had given her: the seal, cord, and staff. By the man who owns these, I am pregnant, she declared, It was a moment of supreme drama. The crowd gathered for her execution now turned to watch Judah's reaction. Would he acknowledge his own role in this situation? Would he compound his injustice by denying the truth in that critical moment? Tamar's courage forced a confrontation not just with Judah, but with the whole system of power and privilege that had marginalized her. She stood, pregnant and accused, yet holding in her hands the proof of a greater righteousness. Her actions, though unconventional, had preserved the very lineage that the men in her life had neglected or actively tried to destroy. The success of her plan hinged not just on careful preparation, but on a deep understanding of justice and divine purpose. While others saw her as a widow to be dismissed or a woman to be controlled, Tamar saw herself as a guardian of the divine promise. Her bold action would transform her from victim to victor, from marginalized widow to mother in the messianic line. Redemption's dawn, the power of truth and grace. The moment Judah recognized his own seal, cord, and staff in Tamar's hands, time seemed to stand still. The crowd that had gathered for her execution fell silent, watching as their patriarch faced a decision that would reveal not just his judgment, but his character. The evidence was undeniable. These personal items, symbols of his authority and identity, testified to his own role in what he had condemned. In this crucible moment, Judah did something extraordinary. Instead of attempting to preserve his dignity through denial or trying to maintain his authority through continued condemnation, he chose the path of truth. "She is more righteous than I," he declared, publicly acknowledging not only his relationship with her, but his failure to fulfill his obligations. These words, spoken by a patriarch in a shame-based culture, represent one of the most remarkable confessions in biblical literature. The significance of Judah's admission went far beyond personal humility. His words, "She is more righteous than I," acknowledged a deeper truth, that Tamar, despite her unconventional methods, had acted to preserve the very promise that he and his sons had neglected. She had understood the weight of divine purpose better than those who were supposed to be its guardians. In that moment of confession, Judah demonstrated that true leadership includes the ability to recognize righteousness, even when it comes from unexpected sources. But the story wasn't finished. As Tamar's pregnancy progressed, another drama unfolded. She was carrying twins, and during delivery, an unusual scene played out that carried profound symbolic meaning. One baby extended his hand first, and the midwife tied a scarlet thread around it, saying, "This one came out first." But the baby drew back his hand, and his brother emerged instead. The firstborn was named Perez, meaning breakthrough, while his brother with the scarlet thread was named Zerah, meaning dawn or brightness. This unexpected twist in the birth narrative echoed themes that had run throughout the story: the overturning of expected order, the surprise of divine providence, the way God's purposes often unfold in unexpected ways. Just as Tamar had broken through conventional boundaries to preserve the family line, Perez broke through to claim his position as firstborn BP. The scarlet thread on Zerah's hand stood as a reminder that what appears to be marked for prominence isn't always what God chooses. The resolution of Tamar's story brought healing and restoration to Judah's family. She was no longer the marginalized widow, but was honored as a mother in Israel. Her twins represented not just the continuation of the family line, but the triumph of divine purpose over human failure. Through her courage and Judah's repentance, what had begun as a tale of wickedness and judgment was transformed into a story of redemption and grace. The contrast with Er's story couldn't be more striking. Where had squandered his spiritual inheritance through wickedness, Tamar had fought to preserve it through righteousness. Where he had brought death through his actions, she had brought life through her. The lineage that seemed threatened by Er's failure was not only preserved, but strengthened, producing twins who would carry forward the messianic promise. Legacy of the erased, timeless lessons from ancient wisdom. The story of and Tamar resonates far beyond its ancient context, weaving together themes that speak powerfully to every generation. When we open the Gospel of Matthew, we find something remarkable in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, where women are rarely mentioned. Tamar's name appears prominently. Her inclusion in this sacred lineage validates not just her actions, but the profound truth that God's purposes often unfold through unexpected channels. From this complex narrative emerge eternal principles that transcend time and culture. First is the sobering reality of spiritual responsibility. Er's story stands as a warning about the consequences of squandering divine privilege. His name, meaning watchful, became a bitter irony. He failed to watch over the very inheritance he was meant to protect. In an age where privilege and responsibility are often disconnected, his fate reminds us that greater blessing brings greater accountability, yet alongside this warning shines the brilliant hope of redemption. Tamar's courage demonstrates that no human failure is final in God's economy. When the designated guardians of promise failed, God raised up an unlikely champion. Her story challenges our assumptions about power, justice, and divine purpose. In a world where systemic injustice often seems insurmountable, Tamar's triumph reminds us that righteous determination can break through seemingly impossible barriers. The narrative carries particular relevance for contemporary issues of justice and gender roles. Tamar's marginalization as a widow, her strategic resistance to injustice, and her ultimate vindication speak to modern struggles for equality and recognition. Her story provides a biblical precedent for women's active participation in carrying forward divine purposes, even when faced with institutional opposition. Perhaps most powerfully, this ancient tale illuminates the nature of true righteousness. It wasn't the outwardly privileged who preserved the messianic line, but the seemingly powerless Tamar. It wasn't conventional morality that earned divine approval, but a deeper righteousness that understood and fought for God's purposes. This challenges our tendency to judge by appearances and reminds us that God's ways often confound human expectations. The legacy of this story continues to unfold through Perez. The son born of Tamar's courage came the line of David, and ultimately Jesus Christ. Er's erasure from the Book of Life made way for a greater story of redemption. His failure highlights an paradoxical truth. Sometimes what appears to be a catastrophic break in God's plan becomes the very means by which that plan moves forward. As we close this exploration, we're left with a profound question in our own lives. Will we be like squandering our spiritual inheritance, or like Tamar, fighting to preserve what truly matters? The choice, as it was then, remains ours, but the promise endures that even from our greatest failures, God can bring forth His greatest purposes. The overall structure moves from historical significance through practical application to personal challenge, making the ancient story relevant for modern audiences while preserving its spiritual depth. As we journey through the second half of life, many of us carry burdens similar to those in this ancient tale. Like Tamar, we may have faced situations where justice seemed distant and hope felt like a fading dream. Perhaps we've experienced the pain of being overlooked, the frustration of waiting for promises unfulfilled, or the weight of responsibilities that seem overwhelming. The story of and Tamar speaks powerfully to our mature years, when we've accumulated enough life experience to understand its deeper truths. We've seen how privilege, like birthright, can be squandered. We've witnessed how institutions and traditions, like those Judah represented, can sometimes fail the very people they're meant to protect. And most importantly, we've learned that it's never too late for transformation and redemption. For those of us who have faced setbacks in our careers, families, or personal lives, Tamar's courage offers a compelling message. Circumstances don't define us, our response to them does. Her story reminds us that wisdom often comes from unexpected sources, and that true righteousness sometimes requires us to challenge conventional thinking. As we mentor younger generations and reflect on our own legacy, this narrative challenges us to consider: are we protecting and nurturing the valuable traditions and principles entrusted to us? Are we, like Judah, humble enough to acknowledge when others show greater wisdom? Are we willing to stand up for what's right, even when it costs us our comfort or reputation? Remember, your life story isn't finished. Like Tamar, you may be in a waiting period, but purpose and meaning can emerge from your most challenging circumstances. Your experience, your struggles, and your wisdom matter. In God's economy, no sincere effort for righteousness is ever wasted, and no one is ever too old to be part of his redemptive purpose.